Welcome to Decarceration Nation, a podcast about radically reimagining America's criminal justice system. You can find all previous episodes on our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. And if you like the podcast, please remember to hit like and to subscribe to the channel below. Jeffrey Bellin served as a prosecutor with the United States Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., and practiced with the San Diego office of Latham and Watkins. Mr. Bellin is currently the Mills E. Godwin Jr. Professor at William and Mary Law School. His new book is Mass Incarceration Nation: How the United States Became Addicted to Prisons and Jails and How It Can Recover. Welcome to the Decarceration Nation podcast, Professor Bellin.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I always ask the same first question. How did you get from wherever you started in life to becoming a federal prosecutor, teaching law at William and Mary? And in particular, how did you go from being a prosecutor to writing a book about ending mass incarceration?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. And it's something of a long and circuitous story, but I'll give you the highlights because I think it's the right question to ask. Honestly, if you're thinking like, why should we listen to you? That's a good question. I'll say it started with, I went to law school because I was interested in criminal justice policy, and I got a federal clerkship out of law school because I had done well for actually Merrick Garland, who everyone knows now. He was a judge at the time, and so I clerked for him in Washington, D.C. And I had this thought that if I was going to speak about criminal justice policy, I needed to know what I was talking about. And the way to, get some expertise was to work in it in some capacity. And I would have been happy to be a defense attorney or a prosecutor or, in any way to kind of get into the system and see what was going on. What happened, or the job I was able to get, was a job at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. And you're right, it's a federal job, but D.C. is unusual because it's a state. There's no state in D.C. So the office there does what a DA's office would do in other jurisdictions. So it's actually a really good way to see what the reality of American criminal justice was like. And then from there, life intervened, and I got ended up going out to California and worked there. I actually had another job at the California Courts of Appeal, working mostly writing criminal cases. And so that was actually really important because then I saw both a different perspective, the court perspective, and also a different state. Like California is very different from DC. And so I did that job for a while. And then finally, I realized that none of these jobs set you up to talk about policy. When I talk about policy to people that I was working with, they would just say, like, what are you talking about? Like, just do your job. And so I realized I had to find some other lever. Was able to get into teaching and started actually at SMU in Dallas. And that was just another way I got some sense of Texas criminal justice there, talking with students and practitioners in that area. Finally moved up here to William and Mary. And when I was here, I felt like the world wasn't talking enough about this topic, the topic of my book. So I started teaching a seminar called Mass Incarceration. So Mass Incarceration Seminar to students, and that helped give me a bigger picture perspective. I was digging into all the research and the numbers and the data, like the overarching picture, because I had a sense of how it worked on the ground in a couple of different places, but I didn't know, the big picture story as well. So I taught that seminar for a couple of years, started doing research, thinking I'm going to write a book about this. By the time the book was done, people had learned about mass incarceration. There were other books, and so I was able to kind of lean into that as well. And then finally was able to write the book I wanted to write, which was, even though there had been other books on mass incarceration, I felt like I had this unique perspective of kind of being in the trenches of it in different areas, and then combining that with an overview that you get from being a researcher. And I tried to write it in a really accessible way. My thought was, I want to explain mass incarceration as a tool to change. Once you need to understand it to change it. But I wanted to explain it in a sophisticated way that was accessible to any audience, and that was what brought me to writing the book.
Oddly enough, you are actually the third guest I've had on the podcast who clerked for Merrick Garland.
Wow.
Is there anything you can share with our audience about your experiences with Mr. Garland, and how hard do you suspect it must be for him navigating questions like how to proceed with investigations on improper use of classified documents involving current and former presidents?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you one story because I tell this to students all the time. It was actually very valuable. It's interesting. So people might not know this, and I didn't know this. I didn't have any lawyers in my family, but when I went into law school, kind of a path. If you do really well in law school, you can get a clerkship. It's a 1 year position with a judge, and the better you do, the more prominent the judge you can get your job with. And so I was really blessed to get this job with even then a very distinguished judge on the DC Circuit. And at the time, he had already done things like prosecuted the Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and things like that. So he was kind of a really well-known figure, both as a judge and for his former career at the DOJ. And the thing about working for him was he stressed like we do things the right way. So we're going to do all the work it takes. We're going to dig into the cases, and then we're going to apply the law and the facts. Just kind of how people want the judge to be behaving. Like that's what he was doing. He was kind of doing everything the right way. Wasn't cutting any corners. And then, um, I got into the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., and there were other attorneys like that. There's a couple other examples of people I worked with who were really professional and thought about the right things and were doing things the right way. But there were a lot of people out there who were not doing that. They were cutting corners. They weren't thoughtful about what they were doing. They were doing things for the wrong reasons. And I always say that it was very helpful for me as a young attorney to have first encountered people like Merrick Garland who were doing it the right way, so that when I later encountered people that were not doing things the right way, I didn't fall for when they would say, well, everyone does it this way, or this is how you have to do it. This is the way it's always done. I had a sense that no, it's not how it's always done. There's kind of the right way. You follow the discovery rules. You dismiss the cases when you don't have enough evidence. Like these are the right things to do. And even though I don't agree with him about everything, that mindset of like we do things for the right reason stuck with me. And hopefully I would have had it anyway. But it was helpful to know that there were people who had succeeded in the profession who weren't cutting corners and weren't sloppy. And then your second question, I mean, it's he's got a very difficult job. I ask that a lot, and he's got a very difficult job. There's few people that I would trust with that job as much as I trust him with it.
You make an early statement in the introduction of the book. You say, politicians claim to be trying to solve the problem of crime. The critical flaw in the last 50 years of tough on crime policies is that this never works. Could you discuss this critical flaw in a bit more depth? What is wrong with kind of the assumptions behind tough on crime policies and politics?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think this is a critical point. One of the things I saw firsthand in practice, and then also you can see in the data. And so one of the things I stress is that if you look at the numbers, you'll see that there's like a lot of fall off between the amount of crime that occurs in a jurisdiction and then the amount of crime that's reported, and then the amount of arrests that fall out of those reports, and then the amount of people that are prosecuted, and the amount of people that end up going to prison. And so, prosecution could say, well, I'm going to get tough, or the legislature could say, I'm going to get tough on, say, carjacking or something, some crime that people are excited about. And the way we're going to get tough on it is we're going to send people to prison for 20 years, mandatory minimum 20 years for anyone that gets caught carjacking. And so in theory, what they think, and you can see this if you read kind of and this is part of the story that I tell, when legislatures are passing these tougher laws, that's what they were saying. They weren't saying like, we're going to pass a tough law on like heroin sales or gun possession because we want to catch a lot of people and put them in prison. They were saying, we're going to pass these tough laws to make people stop. So no one's going to deal heroin once they see how strict the laws are. No one's going to carry a gun around when they see the mandatory minimum for federal gun possession. And no one's going to do any carjacking once you get a 20-year mandatory minimum. And it just doesn't work like that because a lot of these crimes aren't being reported. If you think of like heroin dealing, think how many heroin deals are not reported. That spans everything I talk about in the book. The very low reporting rates for almost all crimes. It's actually two that are highly reported, and they're the exceptions. Car theft, because people have to get their insurance or get the police to stop bugging them about their car that's not their car anymore. And then homicide for obvious reasons. But other than that, it's less than 50% reported. And for some of the crimes, like much less are reported. And so the crimes aren't even getting to the police's attention. And then the police are making arrests and only, again, for homicide, it's like 60%, and then it goes down from there. So they're making arrests in very low percentage of cases. And then from the arrests, a lot of those cases are falling out of the system at various points. And that's something that I saw firsthand as a prosecutor. And so like the amount of these cases that result in someone actually getting the mandatory sentence that was, passed with all this hoopla it's a very small percentage. So I've got this figure in there that I put together from like cities robbery prosecutions, and like for every 100 robberies, there's like 5 people maybe going to prison. And so if you think of that, what you see like what's happening is we're not going to be able to stop robbery with a really tough sentence, because the people that are committing robbery, even if they're just thinking rationally about it, and there's all sorts of other stuff going on, but they're not going to think they're going to get the sentence. They're going to think, they're going to be one of the other 95 circumstances where it's not going to happen. So like, even if you have this, kind of naive assumption that everyone's kind of understanding what the laws are and is going to react to the incentives you create, we can't get people to stop committing crime by making the punishment harsher. All we can do is increase slightly the small subset of people who we're catching and then put them in prison for a really long time. And that's kind of what happened, over a broad scale. We increased slightly the pool, and not slightly, but slightly in each place, and then spread over years and years and places and millions of people. That created a giant number of people in prison, but we were still only catching a small percentage. And so it just doesn't work. And all the studies show this, that severe sentences don't deter crime. And so like, to the extent that that's what the politicians were selling, it never works.
And at the same time, you have kind of people like former Attorney General Bill Barr and folks like the Manhattan Institute, who are claiming that what America has right now isn't a mass incarceration problem. It's an under incarceration problem, which obviously to someone like me sounds a little bit wild. But what drove you, given your background, to take on this topic, and why are they wrong?
Yeah, and actually, that's a great question again. So you've asked like 3 questions. 2 of them I've said already are great, so that says something. But because this is one of my frustrations in this space, is there's a lot of people who are talking to people that already agree with them. And if you really want to make any progress, you got to get people who don't already agree with you to see, they're not going to come around entirely, but to see the points that you're making. And so like a lot of times when I push my students on these questions, that's the kind of thing I say, like, here's what someone else is saying. Like, here's how someone's going to disagree with you. Like, what's your response? And we can't just ignore the response, because a lot of people have these reactions. And that's part of why I wrote the book. It's supposed to reach across audiences, not just for people that already agree about mass incarceration, but to convince people that don't agree. And importantly, like you said, a lot of the people that don't agree that mass incarceration is a big problem are people that hold the levers of power, like Bill Barr, who was a former attorney general. And so, we have to think about, like, what are they going to say? And what's like, when you get this before a congressperson, like, what are the people, their aides and things, going to say when it gets in front of them? And that's one of the things they're going to say, that like, oh, well, really what's going on is we're not catching people. We need to catch more people. It's not. And so, it requires a book. The answer requires a book. And one part of the book that I talk about is, a lot of what goes on is we'll point to something. So say like homicides, and we'll say like, oh, homicides have increased, or homicides are a real problem. And yes, they are. Like, we have to own that's a real problem, and society has to respond to the problem of homicides. But then that doesn't mean we like switch, and now we're going to put drug dealers in prison for 20 years, and now we're going to put people walking around with guns in prison for 5-year mandatory minimums. There's this kind of switch that goes on from like, well, here's the problem we're trying to address, homicides, and now we're going to go after drunk drivers, and we're going to go after, and that's kind of what happened with mass incarceration. Is we started out, there was actually a spike in homicides, and the American people reacted to this idea that we need to be more tough and more severe, because it seemed like crime was spiraling, and the government wasn't responding well to it. And for a while, that's what the reaction to mass incarceration looked like. But then when homicide went back down, and it went down tremendously, and not because of anything, it just kind of ebbs and flows. But when it went back down, the severity stayed, and we could just turn the severity on everything. And we turned it on drunk driving and domestic violence and gun possession and assaults and drugs and all these things. We started treating more severely, and these weren't a reaction to these other things. And so, to me, it's not an answer to say, okay, we're not catching enough people committing homicide, so let's put everyone that's selling marijuana in prison. It's just like, these things don't match up, and there's a lot of this slippage that goes on. And so then the question becomes, well, what do we do about homicide? And again, you can see that the answer is not going to be, well, the way to reduce homicide is to make the punishment more severe, because that's not the problem. Like, we don't have a problem with the punishment not being severe enough, we have a problem with catching people, and really what we care about is preventing homicides in the first place. And so if that's what we're trying to address, and that's what, Bill Barr wants to address, we want to have less violent crime, we want to have less homicides, and I think everyone shares that goal, then we need to think about how do we achieve that goal? And a lot of what I'm doing in the book is pointing out that while often people will say the way to achieve that goal is to put people in prison for longer, there's a tremendous mismatch. Like there's no evidence that that is actually the way to address homicide. And you can see with homicide clearly, because we already put people in prison for a very long time for homicide. There's no one saying, oh, I'm going to commit a homicide because the punishment's so light, right? There's just not. And that's true for all the really serious crimes that we care about. No one is doing them because the punishment is too low or because they think there's not going to be a mandatory sentence at the end of it. To the extent people are thinking rationally, and mostly that's not the case when they're committing these kind of crimes, but to the extent they are, the problem would be that they're not being caught. And so one of the things I say in the book is we need to take the energy we're focused on misdemeanor cases, parole revocations, drug crimes, and shift that to the things we actually care about, like homicides. And then on the other hand, reformers also have to be thinking about how do we reduce the violent crime, even, because A, it's important to do that on its own terms, but B, you're not going to be able to get very far with any kind of reforms if the politicians are able to do this trick where they'll say, oh, homicides are up, so we can't give an inch in any, in any space.
So another kind of spine argument, or an argument that underlies kind of, I think, all the arguments you make in the book, is this notion that the system should be more about finding justice and less about enforcing laws. Can you talk about this distinction that you make between the justice system and the legal system a bit more?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm smiling because you've actually read the book, which makes me very happy. It's always great when you get interviewed by someone who's actually read your book and not.
I'm surprised how often I hear that.
Well, it really makes such a difference when you're answering questions if the person is actually engaged with the material. And you're right. This is a key theme of what I put forward in the book, and runs through kind of everything I talk about. And so, and like the framing of the book is, we didn't used to have mass incarceration. This is a new thing that started in the late 1970s and took a while to really become mass incarceration. But in the 1970s, kind of the way the system was set up was really like the criminal courts were a forum for resolving like disputes that had to be somewhere like a criminal court. And so, you think of it like a family member is murdered or shot, and like the government has to react in some way. They can't just say like, oh, well, figure it out yourself. Because, then we'd have people, vigilante responses and all sorts of chaos. People that were too weak to respond would just be left on their own. And so it makes sense that we need some kind of system that deals with murders and things like that, where we have some, sufficient evidence to think someone has committed a murder. The community is going to care about that. And it makes sense that we'd have something like a court where we decide, is the person actually guilty? And if so, what do we do now? What kind of punishment is appropriate, if any? And so that, to me, resonates with the idea of a criminal justice system. I mean, that's what we've called it for decades. Right? We call this the criminal justice system. And it's for cases like that. That's the idea. We need to figure out, is the person we think that did it actually the person who did it? And if we decide they are, then there can be some kind of government response, and we can call that response a justice because it fits with our conception of, there's been a harm to a discrete person, and the government like seeks accountability on that person's behalf, and that looks, to like justice. And I talk about in the book, there's surveys of things that we can find kind of widespread social recognition that's a justice problem, and then. Then there's this recent shift in, and I'm sure you've seen this, where scholars and advocates have stopped using criminal justice system. They're using the phrase criminal legal system, and their critique
or criminal punishment system,
or criminal punishment, yeah, even worse. I think of it as criminal legal systems like neutral, and then criminal punishment is like negative. And the critique there is that the system isn't entitled to this word justice. It's so much injustice in the system that we're not even going to use the word justice anymore. And so I've taken that critique and tried to separate out what I talk about as the criminal justice system, which I just discussed in the context of homicides, and a criminal legal system, which is a lot of what is happening in the criminal courts now, which is just enforcing the law. If you said to a prosecutor, like, well, what's important about this case? The response would be something like, well, they broke the law and they have to pay for that. No, it wouldn't be justice. And the paradigmatic case for that I talk about are like drug offenses, right? When I was a prosecutor and we got a drug case, the people in my office weren't like, oh, this is really important. We need to prosecute this person to bring justice to the world or something like that. We would say, well, it's, the person, if the evidence suggested that the person was guilty of selling heroin or something, we would prosecute the case, not because there was some sense of justice involved, but because they had broken the law. And so that's what I talk about in the book. We were enforcing the law. We kind of felt like we had to enforce the law in those circumstances. I think that's what the police would say about what those cases are doing. That's what judges will say when they're doing those cases. And so that fits to me as like a criminal legal system, like what's going on there. The courts are being used to enforce the law. And so I talk about in the book that a big part of the mass incarceration story is a shift from using the courts very sparingly to try to just deal with justice issues where we have to have a government response, we have to seek accountability just because of like the society demands that. And then we move to a criminal legal system where we've got just tons of cases pouring into the system. There are drug cases and gun possession cases and violation of parole and all things like that. And it's what's going on is we're enforcing the law. You broke the law, and so you're going to have to pay for this. And over time, and especially because, as I said, the crime went down in the 90s and 2000s and then stayed down, the cases that came into that vacuum were these criminal legal system cases. They were drug cases, assault cases, DWI cases, gun possession cases, illegal immigration cases, all these cases that filled that vacuum. And they weren't, at least, people can fight with me about what's justice and what's not justice, and I'm fine with that because it's not going to be exactly the same for every person. But on the whole, they were like this different kind of cases. They weren't the armed robbery and the rape and the homicide cases. Now we were dealing with just tons and tons of drug cases, lots of weapons possession cases and cases like that. Now, also at the same time, the criminal justice system that I'm talking about was changing too. So there are these two changes going on. One, we're bringing into the system lots of cases that we hadn't used the criminal courts for in the past, mostly drug cases, but a lot of other cases as well. Gun possession is a good example. And then the other change that's going on is for people that are committing the kind of standard core criminal justice offenses like armed robberies and rapes and homicides, we've ratcheted up the sentences tremendously for those too. And those two things happening simultaneously are how we end up with mass incarceration. And just to round off this thought, you'll see a lot of like people will be fighting about things and they'll, you talked about like Bill Barr and things like people that are on the other side. A lot of times the conversations are people talking past each other. So some people are thinking about criminal legal system, the drug war and things like that. And then the person they're fighting with is thinking about homicides and rapes and things like that. And so they're just missing each other in their discussion. And so I think it's important to keep separate kind of like the parts of the criminal courts that are just enforcing the law. They're saying, we're going to put you in prison because you carried a gun and you weren't allowed to carry a gun, from the parts of the criminal justice, the much smaller part, but I think more important part, that is, we're going to have a forum for deciding whether this person is actually guilty of murder, right? Like that piece of the system is, to me, very different from the piece that's saying we're going to put people in prison for selling heroin and things like that. And we can fight about exactly what should be done in the various cases, but I think it's important to see them differently and to recognize that a big part of the mass incarceration problem in America was we expanded our criminal courts to bring in all of these cases that were really just about enforcing the law. They weren't about justice.
I think just to take your challenge up a little bit,
Okay.
I think people like Senator Tom Cotton, for instance, knowing a little bit of how he thinks about these things, might say that you could solve the problem of deterrence by making apprehension and sentencing more likely. And at the same time, because there's a value to retribution, at least in his mind, keeping the severity high. In other words, punish everyone a lot, but also arrest and sentence everybody. So I guess the question that I have in relation to kind of this notion in the book is, what is, I have a lot of answers to this, but what's your answer for why mass incarceration is wrong in that world?
Okay, well, so let me take on the two pieces, because I think there's two pieces. And again, I love this discussion. Like, this is the discussion that America needs to have to move forward, right? The discussion where we're saying, like, here's the other argument. And like, what do you have to say to the other argument? Why isn't the response to what I'm saying, well, let's just catch more people. Like, why aren't we just catching more people? So let's talk about that one first, and then we'll talk about the retribution part second, because I think they're both really important. And so for the catch more people, this is where I think you need to not be an academic to understand this. And this is like, in the book, I talk about just the way the system works in America is not how people think. And the problem is people are watching these TV shows and they're like, in the TV shows, they're always catching people. And so like there was a guy in my office and he used to joke about like the jurors would watch the CSI show and then they would be like, oh, I saw in the CSI show they were like getting fingerprints out of the air. And so like, why aren't you able to get fingerprints out of the air like on CSI? And so in reality, right, so part of it is there's just like that technology doesn't exist to the extent I've confused people about whether that's a thing. But the reality is like the reason we can't catch everybody is because can't prove that everyone's guilty. It's not like technicalities or lack of resources. It's that a lot of crimes happen and you can't figure out who did it. And so like, and that's always going to be true. Like it doesn't, I mean, you could actually change society entirely. We could go to, there are some societies like Singapore or somewhere like where you have a completely totalitarian system, and so then you can catch everybody. But we're just never going to have that in this country. This is a free country, and there's a certain amount of freedom that people are going to have. Also, it's a giant country of tons of people. We have these big cities, crowded cities, and you're just not going to be able to catch people. And so the story I have in there to illustrate this is like these car theft cases we used to always get. And so, it's very common scenario was the police would see that someone was driving a car that was stolen, and they would pull them over. And so you'd say, oh, well, that person's in a lot of trouble. And it's true, they are in trouble because the police would say you're driving a stolen car. But the person would say, oh, I didn't know it was stolen. And so to prove that case, which was dealt with as a car theft case in DC, we would have to prove not just that the car was stolen, but that the person driving it knew that it was stolen. Because the issue was it could have been stolen months ago. And if they didn't know that it was stolen, if someone had just loaned it to them or sold it to them, which actually happens, people steal cars and then sell them to people claiming that they're not stolen, it wasn't an offense, so they were not guilty. And so we just had tons of trouble proving those cases, proving that the person driving the car knew that it was stolen, because how are you going to prove that? And sometimes you could prove it if they admitted it or something like that, but most of the time they didn't admit it, and it wasn't obvious that they knew it was stolen, and so we just couldn't go forward in cases like that. And you could say like, well, I want to stop car theft, I'm going to ratchet up the penalties for car theft offenses, but we were unable to prove these cases. And this is true for a lot of the crimes that most people care about. So robberies and rapes and homicides, they're just really hard to prove, not because there's technicalities or the judges aren't severe or the prosecutors are too easy or the police are lazy. They're just hard to prove because it's hard to prove things. It's just like very difficult. You could think of anyone that has kids or, whatever. You get home and something's broken in your house and one kid says it was that kid that did it and the other kid says it was the other person that did it. Someone says it was the dog that did it. You're never going to know. It's forever going to be a mystery. Make that on a much broader scale. And so it's just not possible to, fully enforce these laws in the ways that the legislatures kind of make pretend we can. And so we're always going to have this disconnect between the really severe penalty and the lot of people that are just not getting punished at all. And that's just part of the reality. If you like go and work in any prosecutor's office, you're going to see that. And this is, by the way, ties into what I always say is the biggest problem we have, which is volume. Like you can defend the American system in the abstract, but you can't, it can't work with the volume that it's under. And you could just go work in any of these big city offices and work in a public defender's office, work in a big city police department. You'll see there's just too many cases pouring into the system. And so no matter how you set the system up, it's going to fail in a lot of different ways, including the ways I was just talking about, not being able to prove cases, because it's just pummeled with all these cases. And so the first thing to make the system run sanely is not to say, let's get more people, but like, let's shrink. We need to shrink the amount of inputs that are coming into the system if we're going to have any chance of having a rational system that actually does anything that we want to do. And so that's the part of the response to, well, why don't we just ratchet up enforcement? It's just not possible. We've seen that over decades to do like much more than we already are. We can shift resources around to focus on the things we care about the most, but we can't say we want everything to be severely punished and we're just going to enforce everything more. It's just not possible. And then the retribution point, I talk about this in the book to a degree, like to the extent you're fighting about what should be the right punishment for various actions. Like, I just don't know how you convince someone. So someone says, if someone sells heroin, they should go to prison for 100 years, and another person says they should have no punishment. Like, you can make arguments about either one of those. And And it's like if it's retribution that you're fighting about, it's really you're just talking about kind of your belief or some kind of amorphous sense of um, desert or something like that. And there's not a way I think to convince people either way. So what you can talk about is if you're going to say, um, well, I say it this way, like what I think the sentences are doing in the United States right now is that they're serving as relative markers. And so, and you see this all the time. If you see like one of the January 6th defendants gets a certain kind of sentence, people compare that sentence to other sentences and say it's either too harsh or too light, or too harsh, yeah, or too lenient because someone else with a less severe crime got more or less. And so you see a lot of this, like a white collar criminal gets a sentence and people say, well, a drug dealer would get even more. And so that sentence is too light. And so we should ratchet that up. And, a lot of what's going on in American sentencing is just comparing sentences one to another. And so what happened over time is when the legislatures ratcheted up the sentences, especially for things that aren't particularly grave and serious, like for drug offenses, like for habitual offenders. And I talk about in the book, the person who stole a jacket in Louisiana and went to prison for life because it was their third offense. If you're a judge and you're sending people to prison for life for stealing a jacket, and then your next case is a murder and your next case is a rape, you're in this weird space where to show you're outraged, you have to compete with what you just did for the person with the jacket or what you gave for the person who was selling some drugs. And now what I call the punishment auction is going on. You're always trying to show that you're being more severe with something. And since everything is kind of ratcheted up, now we're making everything more severe and everything more severe. And so if you want to say, well, people need to be um, in prison for some kind of like dessert or something like that, like I get that. I get that argument. I don't really know that it doesn't make sense to me, but I know that it makes sense to people. But I still think what we can do is we can ratchet down all the sentences to back to how basically they were, and then then it would still be we're treating this very severely because it would just be relative severity. And then the other piece that I think is very important that we've lost track of is it used to be that we would say you get 20 years in prison, and then there was a parole board that would look at 5 years in, is it make sense to keep this person in prison any longer based on how things have played out. That actually was a really effective way at keeping us from getting prisons full of old and ill people, because at some point you're revisiting the question of how long should someone go in and letting people out. And that if you're going to have a system that's like, well, we're going to put someone in for a really long time at point A, then you need to be reevaluating along the way. Does it still make sense? Does it still make sense as society changes and as the person changes? And we've stopped doing that in a lot of jurisdictions where we got rid of parole, and now we're making we're outraged right in the moment A, we're sending you to prison for a really long spell, and we're never going to revisit that again. That makes no sense to me, even if we're in Tom Cotton's world and we're thinking about that people deserve various punishments.
So you go through a lot of different kind of the causes of mass incarceration. One of them that I think I first talked about this probably with James Foreman Jr. several years ago, but is this notion that tougher on crime policies are actually kind of bipartisan.
Yeah.
I think people often kind of assume that Democrats are pro-reform and Republicans are tough on crime. As someone who does legislative work, I know that's not actually a good map. But can you talk a bit more about this and how it factors in?
Yeah, I think this is so important. If you think about any American political like change, like a new law passed or something that we're going to do differently than we did before, you have to keep in mind that the mass incarceration is a huge change from what we did before for decades. So from like 1970 before, like all forever, we didn't have this kind of prison population. And so it was a huge change to go from what we had in 1970 and always before that to what we've got now. And so you should, like, if you're a student of American politics, you should say, well, how could they have done that? How could they have made such a sweeping change, not just federally, but in all the states? And that's one of the things I talk about in the book. It's kind of everywhere. Mass incarceration is a big problem because it's a problem everywhere. It's in California, it's in Texas, it's in Florida, and it's in the federal system. And so, like, how do you get this kind of uniform response across the country? Well, the only way that could have happened was that it was both parties. Because in America, if one party doesn't want to do something, it's very hard for the other party to make that thing happen, to make it stick, and to make it everywhere, right? If you think of like basically today's political controversies, Republicans might be able to get something in Texas, but they can't get it in New York and things like that. And so, and then they can get it federally, but then it goes away in the next election. But what made mass incarceration such a powerful phenomenon over years and years was it was a bipartisan effort. And it's, it's not really fair to say it was equally bipartisan. It certainly was true that Republicans got on this bandwagon first, and they were pushing it harder than the Democrats were. And there was this key inflection point where in the beginning, the Democrats were hesitant to go along with it, but then they kind of gave up and went along. And the paradigm of that is like Bill Clinton kind of becoming this new Democrat and, making a big point about going back to Arkansas to execute someone who was on death row there in a controversial execution, and then saying like, well, now no one can call me soft on crime. And that became kind of a blueprint for Democratic success. I have in the book a story about Bill Clinton in his first term as Arkansas governor had actually pardoned a whole bunch of people and then was defeated in his second term, or defeated at the end of that term, in part because he was labeled as soft on crime, and he kind of learned that lesson and became this model for the tough on crime Democrats. And there's this, a story about Joe Biden also in the 1994 crime bill, where he gets up on the floor of the Senate and says, the Democrats used to say, we want justice, not just, toughness. And I, Joe Biden, say, lock the SOBs up. And so this kind of sense that like being tough is the new Democratic way to do it. Now, it was a reaction to the Republicans and Richard Nixon starting this kind of law and order campaign. But as I say in the book, another person that was pushing this was Ted Kennedy, who was a big liberal hero at the time. And so it was kind of the Democrats getting on board that took away the opposition. So it wasn't that like these ideas weren't already out there, the Republicans were already pushing it. But when the Democrats kind of joined the Republicans, kind of can't beat them, we'll join them. Now there's no one left, right? Once the Republicans and the Democrats are on the same page with something, who's left to stop that train? And that's why, we see not just at the federal level, but across state jurisdictions, kind of everyone getting on board with tough on crime. And that's part of the story of mass incarceration.
Here's a quote from the book. Despite all of the changes, including expanding police departments and increasing arrests, the one variable that is central to effective policing did not improve: the rate at which police solve the most serious crimes. One possibility: police are too busy with other tasks. We've already talked about this a little bit, but I think it's important because there is a weird kind of incentive structure here. We think that everyone's set up to prosecute crimes or to protect people or to get public safety. And the truth is that they're incentivized to get people incarcerated, in a sense, regardless of if that is the best outcome or if there aren't better ways to use their resources. There are clearly opportunity costs left and right to the way that they do things. Can you talk a little bit more about this kind of agenda setting problem? In a sense, it may even be a moral hazard problem that we face with policing in the United States.
Yeah, great. And this is another insight that it was like important for me to have gone through this in the trenches to understand just what you're talking about. And that was that there's a difference in the ability of the police to catch people and the prosecutors to prosecute some cases versus others. And it kind of lines up with the cases we care about the most are actually the hardest to catch people, difficult to get people to report, hardest to catch people, and then hardest to prosecute and win those cases. And I talk about these like civilian generated cases, so like rapes and homicides and things like that. And then there's this other group of cases, and we talked about this, like the criminal legal system cases that are like drug cases and gun possession cases, and also assault cases. If you think about a typical assault case, it's just someone calls 911 because they're being attacked, or someone's in a bar, the bartender calls 911, there's a fight or something. The police come to the scene. It's actually a really easy case for the police to solve, right? Because they come to the scene and the person is a domestic violence case, for example. They just say, well, John hit me, right? And often John is right there. So the police can arrest that person right there. The case is solved, closed in 1 minute. And that's the same with bar fights, person's typically on the scene. And then even easier, like drug sale cases. A lot of the drug sale cases I saw, the DC police had a unit and they would send an undercover officer onto the streets. The officer would buy drugs from someone. A team would swoop in and arrest the person that the officer just bought drugs for. The officers would present that case to the prosecutors. It was a cut and dry case. Even in DC, that was very easy to prove that case. And And then gun possession, drug possession is the same. The case is like a police officer testifies, I stopped this person, I looked in their pockets, there was a gun. I stopped this person, I looked in their backpack, there were drugs. The criminal immigration case, the same thing. It's like this person is in the country and they've previously been deported. The easiest case in the world for a prosecutor to prove. And so part of what happened is we had all these, after this crime surge in the 70s, we had all these resources sent in, more police, more prosecutors, and then the crime goes back down, and we could have avoided mass incarceration because we could have just gone back to how we were. But instead, crime goes back down, and all these police and prosecutors and courts now just turn their energy on what's like right in front of their face. And so that's the 911 calls that are coming in for assaults. That's the drug cases that they can just generate as many of them as they want in a big city, gun possession cases that are like, easy to, once you catch the person, easy to prove. And so the prosecution and police are just, and courts are, it's easy to punish because it's easy to get convictions in these cases. And also because it's so easy to get convictions, these cases are, I say, like tailor-made for plea bargains, because you kind of see what's going to go. The police are going to show up for trial. There's not going to be any twists and turns. Now, maybe the police are lying, but they're good at testifying. They're convincing the juries. These cases typically end up with convictions. And so we've got all this new resources, police, prosecutors, and they're aimed at, whatever's in front of them. And now it becomes these kind of easy criminal legal system cases. And I show this in the data, conviction rates go up because now we're focused on cases that it's easy for prosecutors to, easier for police to catch people and, bring the case to the prosecutor, easy for the prosecutor to win. And this is a sharp contrast to cases like, rape cases and robberies where the police arrive at the scene after this crime has happened, but it's very hard to figure out who did it. And even if you get a suspect, it's kind of hard to prove that they were guilty. And those are difficult cases to prove. And so this shift to, like you said, moral hazard, I think one of the ways I always say this to people about, like, if you want to understand like a big city criminal justice system, think of your local Department of Motor Vehicles. Like, it's not like what you see on TV. It's more like just any other bureaucratic agency you see. It's a government agency, and they've got this kind of like vague marching orders. And it's like, well, the police are going to, for a prosecutor office, the police are going to bring cases to you. And then your job is to like process those cases in some manner. And that's what they did. They just prosecuted the cases, and any bureaucracy kind of gravitates towards what's easy to do. And these cases were easier. And that's what we see in the data, just many more of these drug cases, assault cases, gun possession cases, illegal immigration cases, and that becomes a large chunk. Now, all these pieces are part of the puzzle. It's not like that's just the problem. It's not like violence, crime is just, all these things are part of the puzzle. And one of the things I'll just mention is like part of what's unique about my book is I'm willing to embrace that it's all these different things, right? I think a lot of people to sell their book are like, here's the one thing that's causing it. That's not me. I wrote a book that's like, here's all the things. And one of the other pieces we haven't touched on too much, parole revocations become a huge part of this story as well. And probation, people getting violated on probation, that's actually like a third of prison admissions. So a huge chunk that no one ever talks about. All these things are part of the story. And it makes it so if you're talking to an agent, like say I was at the beginning of this process, and you're like, here's my take on mass incarceration, it's much more complicated than people think. There's tons of things contributing. The agent is like, well, that's not going to sell, right? But so that's like, so maybe it's not going to sell, but it's actually the right explanation. And it's what you need to know if you want to change the system is each of the things that are contributing and all these parts. I think a lot of people are fighting about, well, it's not drugs and it's not race and it's this and instead of this. It's not the federal system. It's the, but they're all kind of right in a way. Yeah, it's not any one of those things, but then they're like, but it's this instead, and that's wrong. It's actually all of those things is the explanation. And that's why it's such a big deal and such a challenge to tackle.
So as we start to turn towards your solutions, and you're right, there are there's lots of detail throughout the book, and I figure it's better to kind of get at major themes and let people read the book and get kind of the more details. But before we turn to your solutions, which I think are actually fairly unique, and you take some big swings, and I think they're good swings. I was talking to someone the other day who was talking to me about it become normal in their state for a few of the crime beat reporters to go after judges publicly whenever they reach a lenient decision or what they perceive to be a lenient decision. In so many of the areas you highlight, politicians, police, prosecutors, judges, these are all really, in a sense, political questions. They're responses to political pressure led by people in the press. How do we get, before we talk about your solutions, how, at some level, I mean, the old saying that politics is the art of the possible. How are we going to get to kind of big swings and radical solutions in a world in which most people, and I think this is borne out in lots of research and lots of public policy research, still believe the story that you say is kind of ridiculous at the beginning, that we're doing this to solve crime, and I think you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do. Again, this is the question, and so as like kind of half joking, but it's true that like so one thing about my book that makes it difficult to sell is it's not the like here's the one thing that you never thought of that caused mass incarceration. It's like here's all the things that are causing this tremendous problem. The other thing about it that makes it less palatable, I think, to some folks is because like part of it is what you're saying. My diagnosis of the problem is it kind of says that we're all to blame to a degree. Like I'm not one of these people that says, oh, the American public is like fooled and they don't realize what's going on. That if they really knew, they would be outraged. I think the American public is part of this dynamic, and it's not just like politicians are fooling them into thinking that we should lock people up and stuff like that. I think politicians are saying that in part because voters react to that. Voters kind of like this message. And so that's the challenge. What you said is exactly the challenge. One of the ways to, we could say, here's the right way to change it, but to get these changes enacted into legislation or get them to translate into elections for judges and prosecutors and mayors and things like that, we need to get the voters to understand some of the stuff that we're talking about. And how do we do that? And so, yeah, like I think this is a crucial thing. One, to see that we need to get people to understand this message, and then two, like how do we convince them? And that's where I think some of the arguments that people are making are self-defeating in a way. And so saying it's just race, or it's just prosecutors, or it's just drugs, right? Like these things, they're not going to work in the long term, right? It'll get a few people, like it gets a group of people that really care about that one thing on board. But what we need is like a coalition. We need a whole, like everyone. Well, I guess you need like 50% or something, depending on how gerrymandered the jurisdiction is, to feel the way that we're talking about these issues. And how do you do that? And I think that like that's we have to just talk about these issues, and we have to get people to engage with like the thing that you started with, which I think my instinct is that about this problem because it's not you're dealing with policymakers, and so to get through this idea that we're not saying that it's not bad for people to deal heroin, or it's not bad for people to commit assaults. Like these are bad things. The point is the solution to these problems, like how do we deal with these problems? It's not incarceration, and it's not incarceration for longer, and kind of disconnecting this idea between this is the problem and then incarceration is the solution, right? That like I think attacking that, I think that's the weak spot in the policies that got us mass incarceration. And that's why I try to frame in the book this argument about, I'm not saying crime isn't bad. I'm not saying like there is no crime, which sometimes people start arguing that. I mean, people know if there's crime or not. And the way to deal with this is to say there are better, more effective ways to deal with the real problem of crime. And the most obvious example is the drug war. It's just like clear as day at this point that we can't stop the flow of drugs by putting people in prison. Like it couldn't be clearer that that's right. But what I argue in the book is that also applies to other things that people are uncomfortable talking about, but it actually applies to a lot of other things that we're treating as treating in the criminal courts that we didn't used to. And I think getting that message, now it's hard, right? It's like, but that's the message, and that's what I'm doing. Like that's the point of this book. That's why I didn't want to write a book that was like, more catchy, but I think doesn't get you where you need to go, which is to get people to understand, the way that all these little pieces are working is fed by, like you said at the beginning, this one idea. And the one idea is tougher stuff that like stops crime. And if we can dismantle that one idea, then I think we'll be able to get people on board more generally. But that's the idea, you're right, that stands in the way of a lot of the reforms, especially the most meaningful ones.
So your big swing, I think, well, there's a couple of them, but the first big swing is that you think we should essentially just go back to the way we did things in the 70s. And do you want to talk a little bit more about what that looks
I would
like?
like to clarify. Yes, please. So when I first started talking about this, like a lot of bad stuff went on in the 70s. So, and this is before I was even born. So,
Sure,
I'm
I
not,
lived in New York City in the 70s. I was
okay.
only 3, but that was not, the greatest period of New York City.
Yeah, I mean, and outside of criminal stuff, there's lots of terrible things that we were doing in the 70s that we're not doing anymore. And I'm not suggesting we go back to that. And so I try to be careful in the book when I say just what you say. I say, with respect to the use of incarceration, that's the thing I want to go back to. We didn't used to use incarceration the way we're using it now. So
I
what I mean
definitely
by that is,
wasn't. I definitely wasn't saying that everyone should go back to bell bottoms. Was your argument?
yeah, exactly. Actually, it's funny you say that. In one of the versions of the book, I had a graphic that was like the top shows. It was like Laverne and Shirley or something, and I had like a line just like that. Like, I'm not saying we need to go back to watching Laverne and Shirley, but just this one point is just a kind of interesting because this is one of the things I use to try to say, like, we can do this. We can go back, like, we can have these low incarceration rates. We had them for a long time. Like, it's not as scary as people think. And I think that's one of the things, like it's not like, if you say to people, well, let's abolish the system, like, that scares a lot of people. They're worried about what the replacement is. Whereas if you say, well, let's go back to what we were doing with respect to incarceration in the 1970s, that's like, it might still scare some people, but it's not as dramatic because we lived with that for a long time. We had a functioning society. Everything was um, like, we were punishing the serious crimes even in the 1970s. And so, like, that's what I'm talking about. We can go back to 1970s level incarceration rates. Like, that's a doable goal. And we know that because we've done it before. And each state would end up, where they were in the 1970s. That would be a fine, like, I'm not saying like every state has to do exactly the same thing. And I just think you couldn't, right? For the reasons you talked about, there's different politics in every state. But in terms of setting a benchmark that's realistic that people can grab onto, you can say, we can return to the incarceration rates that were the norm for this country for decades. And we don't know that the data as you go back, it gets a little strained, but certainly from 1930 to 1970, we had an incarceration rate of like about 100 per 100,000, and then went up to like 700 per 100,000, and then it's dipped recently. But there's no reason we can't go back to those incarceration rates, which are also the incarceration rates that we see with kind of countries that we typically compare ourselves to. And so that's like the benchmark that I give. And I think it's just useful, it doesn't have to be exactly that, but I think it's useful to have something to say to people when because they're going to do this now, and they're going to say, well, look, we're no longer the #1 incarceration rate country. Have we solved mass incarceration? Are we done now? And I think, we have to have something to say besides just let more people out. I think there's a valuable benchmark in saying, let's go back to the historical norms for this country, because we live with that, and it was that was a system we can live with.
I mean, you have a lot of solutions. Just to tease another one, you talk about getting rid of the federal prison system, which I think is, I think a lot of people I know would agree with that.
I'm gonna have to clarify again on that, but yes.
Okay, go ahead and clarify.
Almost all. I say almost abolished, something like that. But yes, fair. But and this fits my point, right? That it's, if you look at talk about what I talk about as the criminal legal system, the federal system, you look at the data, it's almost entirely drugs, gun possession, and criminal immigration cases, and then supervision for those crimes. That's almost all of it. Now, there's still some left, and that should stay, like things that only the federal government can do, like prosecuting police officers or things like that are really difficult problems. We can have the DOJ do that, or like president corruption cases, right? Like that kind of thing. I don't want to freak out Attorney General Garland. So that's, just to be clear, we can have some of the federal system still, but we can get rid of this criminal legal system, which is almost all of what it is. And it's the same point. In the 1970s, it was just this small thing that did things only the federal system could do. And then, like I say, the explanation for the growth of the federal system is that fighting crime became popular, and the federal politicians didn't want to be left out. And that is one of my more radical solutions. But it's abolish most of the federal system, not the entirety.
Well, I mean, one point you're making over and over again is that nuance is important, and I certainly appreciate that. I may be overselling a few of the things a
No,
little.
well, you're just like the agents. One of the agents told me, um, he was like, we can like what you should do is turn that chapter that you just mentioned. That should be your book. So they wanted me to just write the whole book about that because that was the exciting one.
So you talk, I do want to talk a little bit about one thing, which is that you talk about, there's a section at the end where you talk about increasing the number of police as a solution to crime. Based on a lot of research, I've read a lot of that research. It seems to me, from my perspective, when I read that research, what I think is that what they mean is that if police are in a particular place at a particular time, they deter crime in that particular place at that particular time. And I get that hotspot policing it can be effective. I've had Thomas Apt on the podcast, but there's a lot. Most crime doesn't happen in a particular place at a particular time. So I find that they always make this correlation to kind of how that would reduce homicides, and it might in those particular places where a lot of those things happen. But it's not really just as simple as just adding more police, right?
Yeah, great. Yeah, you're right. And one of the things I try to do in the book, because I'm trying to reach a broad audience, is I try not to say things that are just like, take my word for it. Like, I don't want more police. I do want more police. And so when I talk about things that we can change or things that I think cause mass incarceration, the book is just full of data. Like, here's why I think it's drug cases. Here's why I think it's assaults. Here's why I think it's gun cases, and just all the data I can find to fill in that explanation. So you're not just relying on like my telling you or what I think should happen, but you've got the data. And so you're right. There's these studies that suggest that more police leads to less crime. And what I'm trying to think of in the latter half of the book, or latter portion of the book, is how can we decrease crime in other ways than trying to ratchet up penalties? And so one of them is just to have more people preventing crime. And so, but you're absolutely right that there's a lot of nuance to this. And part of the story I just told was we had all these police and they just started focusing on things besides the things we care about. And so, it's very dangerous to have a lot of law enforcement agents because they might start doing things you're not expecting or wanting them to do. And so one way to think about, what these studies are showing, and I think this makes sense, is it doesn't really have to be police. What you need is people focused on the problem. And it can be violence preventers, or it could be social service people, or it could be like any type of person trying to solve the problem of homicides in the city block, or trying to solve the problem of rape in a certain area. Like, wherever these problems are, we need to bring resources, and resources typically mean people, to try to solve these problems. And one of the things I think is just very interesting about American policing, that people don't talk about, like, they're very quick to say, like, well, the police shouldn't have drones, or the police shouldn't have facial recognition technology. What I think of is really what about guns? Like, we don't need, like, obviously there needs to be some guns available to police, but if I'm saying we don't need to react to the problem necessarily with police, you certainly don't need to react to these problems with police walking around with guns all the time. Like, that's not the answer to a lot of these problems. And so we can certainly, compromise on, well, if you don't want to add police, like, I understand why people might not want to add police in certain areas. But what I want to do is just prevent crime. And so there are these studies that show you can prevent crime by lighting and, police and videos and things like that, and technology. And so, like, let's take advantage of that. And if we don't want to use police, we'll call them just like security or something, and we won't give them guns, and we won't have them refer cases to prosecutors or whatever. But this is just to the earlier discussion we had. We need, like, if we want to change the system, I think it's naive to think you're going to be able to just reduce the severity without also doing something about the crime that kind of generates the severity. Otherwise, we'll just keep being in the same pattern where we'll get some reform, and then crime will become a problem because it's always kind of ebbing and flowing, and then we'll get more severity again. And so I think we need to think of it as like two problems that we're solving. We're solving too much incarceration, and we're solving too much crime. And one doesn't solve the other, but they're both kind of related, and we need to pay attention to both of them.
I always like to ask people if there are any criminal justice related books, I think we talked about this a little earlier, that they like and might recommend to our listeners. Do you have any favorite books currently?
I do. So one came up already. James Foreman's book, Locking Up Our Own, I think is just wonderful. And I mentioned that I was a prosecutor in DC. He was a public defender in DC before me, but it was just so interesting to read that book, both as an academic, but also because it really put a lot of my experiences in perspective, because DC is such a unique jurisdiction. So I think that's a great book, kind of a courageous book that he wrote, and I'm glad he got a ton of recognition for doing that. The other book I'd mention is Ghetto Side by Jill Lavoie. I don't know if you've seen that one. I think that's just a tremendous book about the problem we were just discussing. Like how, oh, okay, there you go. Very good. That's the book. Like how do we solve the crimes that most people
sort of
care
odd that I
about?
just had that on the table.
Yeah, I did. You didn't know. I just say it for the listeners. You didn't know I was going to mention that one, and it just popped. He had it on the screen as soon as I said it. But really interesting, like take on, we can solve these problems if we devote more resources. So just kind of the thing we're talking about. And then one so those are pretty famous. One that people might not be as aware of. There's one called The Feminist War on Crime by Aya Gruber, and that one, again, these are like cheating by talking about books that are similar in perspective to my book, but it talks about a lot of what I said about how we've ratcheted up severity. Doesn't necessarily mean we did it for bad reasons. Like often the ratcheting up of severity was noble, or at least had noble intentions. So like taking domestic violence more seriously, right? Like I understand where people were coming from, but her book does a nice job of explaining just with that little piece of it why that effort, you can criticize, and that kind of ties into some of what I was talking about with assaults. Like one of the big changes over time was how we treated assaults, and that's something that her book offers a lot of perspective on. So that's 3. Is that good enough? I did 3.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I always ask the same last question. What did I mess up? What question should I have asked, but did not?
That's so funny. That's a, so I told you I was a prosecutor. There was another prosecutor in my office named Steve Yarosh. Maybe he's listening. He used to ask that at the end of his cross-examinations. Not did I mess up, but he said, was there anything I didn't ask that I should have asked? And you'd think I never heard that. And people would just be floored that he would ask that, because you're like, people always say like a lawyer never asks a question they don't know the answer to. But he was just like so open about what he was doing, and he would ask the question and there wasn't really an objection to it. And so it's so funny. That reminded me that he used to ask that. I think it's a great question. I'll say this. One of the things I touched on this that people may not appreciate. So because the book doesn't have this is the one thing, and it's not as so it's an academic press book. And so that means, the question might be, why haven't I heard of this book, right? And so the answer is, because it's an academic press book, that allowed me to write the story that I told. But I purposely wrote it for everyone, like for an audience beyond the academic world. And I asked them to price it so that people could buy it, so the paperback is reasonably priced. And so like people should just appreciate that there's like no marketing for the book. It's just me going on podcasts. And then people like Josh, and I should say this, he does a great job of finding people, so you could take me out of the equation, but the people on his podcast are like the who's who of who you want to hear from. And so that's why you haven't heard of this book. And if you like it, or if you get it and read it, or just like the podcast, like what I need is word of mouth. So hopefully people will tell others about the book, and we can get the true story of mass incarceration out there.
And where can people find your book?
Oh yeah, so you can find it on Amazon. That's the easiest place to buy it. But make sure you get the paperback, because the hard copy is priced too high. Don't tell the publisher I said that.
Well, I thank you so much for doing this, Jeff. It was really great to talk with you.
It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. You can learn more about this episode in the notes, or visit our website, www.decarcerationnation.com. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, and please like this episode and leave comments below. Special thanks to Andrew Stein, who does the editing and post-production for me, to Ann Espo for helping with our transcripts and social media images, and to Alex Mayo, who helps with our website and does the video transcription. Make sure and add us on social media and share our posts across your network. Also thanks to my employer, Safe and Just Michigan, for helping to support the Decarceration Nation podcast. Thanks so much for listening to the Decarceration Nation podcast. See you next time.